Hey, well, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further in hopes that it becomes more helpful for you and your life and your faith. I'm Jeremy. I'm your host, and I'm sitting here with Buck Giebelhaus. Buck, how are you doing?
Well, I'm a little tired today. And so, we were talking before the podcast, and I was like, oh, man, Luke and I have been working out at Gold's Gym, and I've been doing things that I haven't done in, like, my whole life. And these like squat things and, these things like you do that I don't even know. Man, I'm telling
Curls?
you. Yeah, that
Curls?
would be it.
Okay.
My whole body is like saying, what have you done to me? And so I feel like I should be sleeping right now. But I'm not. I'm excited to be here with you.
Yeah, I feel it. I feel the energy emanating from you. That's good.
Yep.
Well, cool. Well, I want to jump in because we've got some big questions to talk about today. We are wrapping up a series called Welcome Home, and we just did part 4 this past Sunday.
Yes.
And this has been all about eternity, a conversation about eternity. And we have talked a lot about both big picture aspects and specific things down to like, what is heaven like? And are we going to see people we know in heaven and things like that? And what is hell? How does all that make sense? And NDEs and things like that. And this past week, you talked a lot about judgment and, rewards in heaven and what that's going to look like and what Jesus says about that specifically, because he surprisingly had a lot to say about rewards in heaven.
That's incredible.
Yeah, and so, I want to unpack a couple of aspects of that. Before I do, we did get a question submitted, and I just wanted to ask this question. This individual asked this question, and it's a little bit, it's a long one, but I want to give it enough context, and so I'm just going to read it off of here. But basically, they say, I've never doubted the existence of heaven and hell, but I'm feeling skeptical about NDEs, near-death experiences. I haven't read many books on the subject, except for one called 90 Minutes in Heaven. The reason I'm struggling with NDEs is because of what Hebrews 9:27 says. It says, "And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment." How can a person experience heaven or hell and then come back to life again one day in light of this verse? Are these visions they are experiencing like Paul, who said he was caught up to heaven, or like John had in Revelation? I'm genuinely interested in your thoughts on this. So the question is, how can a person experience heaven or hell and then come back to life to die again one day in light of this verse?
Yeah, so first, I think this is a fantastic question, and I'm really glad he asked it, or she asked it. And so I want to first acknowledge where they said they're skeptical of NDEs.
Yeah.
And I would just acknowledge that.
Yeah.
I'd just lay that on the table and say, you should be.
Yeah, affirm it a little bit. A lot of people are.
I mean, I feel like if you're a human being, you're going to go like, like I've shared with you some of the points in this series feel like, a little bit like Narnia. It feels like a little bit like, we have a little bit of dots to connect, but like it's way out there.
Yep.
And so when we're talking about these things beyond our reality, beyond anything that we've ever experienced in our life, beyond, what our imagination is even capable of today, it's like, gosh, I'm skeptic. Okay. Man, that's fair. That feels really honest.
Yeah.
So I think that's important, and I would say I'm with them. Like, some of the NDEs I've heard, I'm like, I have questions and those kind of things. But to the heart of the question, I think there's a couple things at play. There's many books on NDEs, and it's surprising. So it's like any one of those fields that you're like, I hear from a distance about this thing, and it feels a little bit goofy, so I'm not going to explore it. But once you start to take steps towards NDEs and start to read books, I think John Burke at Gateway Church here in Austin has a fantastic book, and I think it was like 2 decades. He didn't write the book because he was like, man, this is so weird to talk about NDEs, and people are going to think I'm weird. I think, the majority of the doctors that I quoted, I think in part 1,
it was part 1.
Yeah, part 1. I mean, when you read their stories, most of the doctors, it took a long time for them to actually come out and share their NDE story and then finally write the book.
Yeah. Because
they had their careers, they had, their prestige, they were accomplished as doctors. They didn't need this, but they couldn't deny it.
Yep.
So I think, when you lean into NDEs and you start researching it, it becomes pretty fascinating. And, there's millions of NDEs just in America. The consistency, I talked about a lot of those points. But I would say this, a lot of the NDE stories I read are not actual like, hey, I'm in heaven and hanging out. The NDE stories are I'm in hell and hanging out. The NDE stories is I've died and I've met this man. I've died, and I started to see these colors and experience these senses I've never been able to experience. I died, and my cognitive memories were there. I died, and I felt this incredible unconditional love. So as they described almost the front door. They describe like a foyer.
Yeah.
They don't describe if you were to go into a house and the living room and the kitchen and the bedrooms and all these other aspects of it. They just describe that they're going into, they are entering. So that's the majority of NDEs that I've read and familiar with in the books that people talk about. Certainly there are some that go much, much further.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important point. It's just a data point. It doesn't, there's not a ton to extrapolate from that other than to go, okay, so it's the beginning of, and they begin to tell us. And then a lot of the NDEs, and this is an important point, I think, a lot of the NDEs say, and I think there's a stat, I don't know if this is correct, but I think 90% of them said, that they didn't want to come back. Everything in them wanted to stay. Mm-hmm. And then, God or this individual, a lot of these individuals call this person Jesus, said, I have more work for you to be done. So you're at the front door, you want to enter into the home, you see things you've never seen before, experience things, and then the person oftentimes, regardless of your religion, culture, they all come back to this man, says, I have more work for you. There's purpose for you. And so people would call, I think, or classify an NDE as a miracle. That's why the skepticism is there. And when it comes to miracles, it's important to know the purpose of a miracle is not that you live forever. Like if you're healed miraculously, like Jesus would do multiple times, it wasn't, or when he walked on water, it wasn't the idea to go, oh my gosh, now we all get to walk on water. We're all you're healed from this sickness. Well, eventually you die. Mm-hmm. So the point of a miracle can't be like forever. The point of the miracle is always to punctuate a point. So it's like Jesus spoke these profound truths. I mean, he shows up and says, by the way, guys, I'm God. Yeah. Okay, well, that's really hard to believe. But then he begins to provide these miracles as punctuation points to a profound truth in history. So a lot of times these NDE stories are just confirming truths, are just, miracles. It feels like a miracle. They come back and they're able to give us insight. They're able to punctuate something perhaps that you don't have to fear, that your hope is not in vain, that there really is a God. And maybe God is using that. Again, I'm getting in a world this is a God world, that, God is using that in a sovereign way to influence a family member, to influence thousands of people, to influence, that part of the world. But miracles always have a purpose. So I think that's part of it. And then last of all, just with the question, I would completely agree. These fall much more categorically in a vision versus like, hey, I've experienced all of heaven. I've experienced all of hell.
Right.
The closest, there's a lot of stories of people who actually were at the front door and walking down the hallway of hell.
Yeah.
There's one, if you want to look online, it's by Howard Storm. He's probably one of the most popular individuals. But again, that when he describes what he experienced, when he described what was happening, it feels very much at the front door, and it feels very much in light of, as Paul talked about the vision being taken to heaven and seeing a vision versus, hey, I experienced the whole reality of. And so, hopefully that's helpful in this question.
Yeah.
And just, hopefully whoever asked this, that you can just know that your skepticism, don't feel bad about that. You should be skeptical and ask a lot of questions.
Yeah, for sure. The verse says, a man to die once. Is there an aspect of dying once, like fully dying, right? Mm-hmm. It's like that's where it gets into the gray area with NDEs is like, yes, they were dead physiologically.
Yeah, clinically they were dead.
But they didn't stay dead. And I think the verse is like, you're going to stay dead once, right?
Yeah, and then the verse goes on to face judgment. And so, that kind of judgment is now you've gone all the way through the door. You're into the living room. Now you're in the kitchen. And in the kitchen, you face judgment. Yep. And as I said in part one, there's a good one and a bad one. And so in terms of like what that looks like, there's very, very little detail all the way there. So I think the verse can still remain true. And I think God, and, again, I think Jordan talked about this in part 3. If the category of God exists, then miracles are very much possible. Mm-hmm. It's small potatoes.
Yep.
If God spoke the universe into existence.
Yeah, we talked about that last week's podcast too.
Yeah, so that's small potatoes for God to go, hey, I want to give you a glimpse of what's to come, but I want to do that for your encouragement. I want to do that to punctuate a point. I want to do that for a purpose so you can bring encouragement to your community, to the people around you, or to this very specific individual. God does that all the time.
Yeah.
And so I think this is what NDEs probably fall into.
Yeah. It's funny. Last night we had our community group, and we started off with 2 truths and a lie. And one of the guys.
So you're lying in your community group, lying in church. Huh?
Oh yeah. But it's on purpose,
Sure.
and then But one of the guys was like, his first 2 things he said was, I almost died at the intersection of 29 and Ronald Reagan. He got in this big car wreck, and he said I almost died, and then he said I did die when I was in high school and I drowned. And he had like totally made it up. Like that was just his lie for the whole thing.
Wow.
And he just like, but hearing somebody go, I almost died, and then I did die, and then here's my last thing. It's like, well, no, you didn't die because you're right there.
Yeah.
So you didn't stay dead. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
Yeah. So
which categorically would put that in the vision then.
Yep, for sure. Yep. And he was lying anyways, so he didn't actually die. But anyways, all right, question 2. Let's jump into question. We have digressed quite a bit.
It's good.
So in this past message, you talked a lot about rewards in heaven. That there are rewards as it relates to work, how we work here on earth. Rewards as it relates to how we love people, how we leverage our resources. You used the Schindler's List clip, which is just one of the best ways I think I've ever experienced to capture, perhaps what that feeling is going to be like when we get to heaven one day and we have that feeling to go, man, we could have done more. We see things in a new way.
Yeah.
But I think it's hard to understand. Jesus talked about rewards in heaven a lot, but it's hard to understand exactly what that's going to look like. Can you give us some examples of what rewards in heaven are actually going to look like?
Yeah. So I want to preface this with it was a subtle comment I made this last week. Is that I feel like the scriptures give us dots, and we can connect lines to the dots, and the dots that we start connecting lines to begin to draw a picture. And so if you remember when you were a little boy, or maybe it was just my generation, because we're what, 5 years, 2 years apart. We're not that far apart, are we?
No, we're buddies.
But when I was a little boy, there were coloring books that had 1, 2, 3, and they were just dots, and you would just follow these dots, and all of a sudden you're like, man, it's a giraffe, and then you color in the giraffe and all the details, and then this dot leads to this, and the giraffe's like wearing a cape, and you're like,
I do remember those.
Yeah,
that's not just your generation.
Okay,
I did that too.
Yeah, so we're together here. This is good.
Yeah,
we're having a moment. So in this moment that we're having, I think I want to preface it that way, because we have dots. Sometimes we don't even have the lines. So to be able to go like, here's exactly what's going to happen. Here's, you're going to get rewarded X amount of dollars for this activity, and, it's going to be used in the economy of heaven, and what Jordan talked about in part 3, the redemptive continuity, to where there's going to be a physical heaven. It's, he used the phrase, it's the home you look for or long for, and beaches and mountains and experiences and hiking and, adventure and perhaps golf and sporting events and, hanging out, back floating in the ocean, and, these kind of things are in the lake. I mean, all those kind of things are, those are some of the dots we have. And so I think it's really important that I preface it that way and just say, honestly, I cannot give a very solid, concrete answer to this question.
Yeah.
But you can say it stands to reason. You can say a statement like, therefore, based on what the scriptures paint the picture of. And again, I would highly recommend people go back to part 3. If you haven't listened to that, please listen to what Jordan said, because with that as a foundation, to think about this concept of it's physical. It's not harps and halos and clouds and spiritual, and you're the spirit being with a halo for eternity. No, it's very much like take earth, take a renewed earth, take a redeemed earth, take a sinless earth, and it's almost like, it's a restored Garden of Eden. It's a restored the way God intended it to be. And now it's with the new covenant of Jesus Christ, and we'll kind of get into that next. But this whole beautiful, it's earth, everything you love about earth. So now with that, there's economies, there's experience, there's beaches, there's all kinds of opportunities to be part of. And Jesus, with that dot, continues to paint this picture. Store up treasure in heaven. Hey, you will be rewarded for the choices you make here. And we should fundamentally choose in our life out of the grace of what God has done for us through Christ.
Yeah.
I mean, that should be our greatest motivation to go, oh my gosh, Jesus Christ, what you have done for us. But if we stop there, and I said this, I think in part 1, I said, if you stop there and say, well, that's enough. This in part 4, I said, then you're super spiritual. And the challenge with that is Jesus went far beyond that. So if you're like, well, that's enough, well, then you're disagreeing with Jesus, because Jesus said, no. I mean, that's wonderful. I get why you say that, and I really appreciate that. And that should be your foundational core motive to do the things you do, to love as I've loved you. But there are rewards. And so that's where it stands to reason to go, hey, maybe the experience in the mountains, that's what rewards would be used for. Yeah. Maybe, there's privileges that, there's upgrades that you'll be able to experience in heaven. Maybe there's places, or as Jordan talked about, if we get as far out as this, it's like Elon with space, and Jordan kind of teased that out in part 3 to go, man, imagine space travel in heaven. I mean, these are getting again into kind of that Narnia land, if you will.
Yep.
So we're speculating a ton, but there is precedent. There are dots to connect and draw lines to that would say, gosh, it really stands to reason that your choices in this life is a test. This life is finite. This life is a flash in the night. Jesus constantly said, man, trust me, trust me, trust me. I love you, kiddo. Trust me with rewards in heaven, because these rewards, you can actually store them up. And, I think with redemptive continuity, what Jordan talked about, I think they can be used for activities. I think they can be used for maybe, I think Jordan talked about Whataburger. And when he bit into that, he's a tear came down his eye.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of thing. Well, there may be different foods you can have access. And when you get there, the picture is that you're going to be incredibly eternally grateful. Because now this is forever. And now you lived your life. And then things begin to make more sense, where Jesus says, hey, the first will be last. If you lose your life for me, you're actually going to find it. There's a greater meaning than what I'm talking about here in terms of rewards, but all of that picture starts to fit together to go, oh my gosh, Jesus, like you are going to prepare a physical place for us. And we have opportunity to impact, not if we get in or not, that has everything to do with Jesus, but to impact the privilege and responsibilities and opportunities and access. Just like the more resources you have here, you're able to do more things. So I know that's a little bit general, a little bit global, but like I said, those are the dots we have, and to go, you're going to be able to supersize every meal. Like I feel like that may be too specific, or you're gonna be able to be in this hotel, versus this hotel. I don't know. I think when we all see it, it's all going to make sense, and. I also think, it's a world absent of sin. So I think with that being so, and our happiness isn't based, like in this world, on stuff. In this world, very much our happiness is based on stuff.
Yeah.
Happiness should never be based on stuff.
Yeah.
Happiness is based on who Christ is.
Yeah.
And who he says you are. And we'll get a full picture of that in heaven.
Yeah, heaven is the culmination of what you just said. It's interesting. It's like, I'm going to be able to supersize it in heaven. Well, in heaven, like, the reason we want to supersize it here is there's something that makes us happy about that. You know what I mean? So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. As you were talking, I was just thinking, there are aspects of things that we do in this world today that are good things that not only are good things and build up rewards in heaven, but I think it also keeps us, like, kind of focused on in this life. One of them is, like, giving money. Whether it's giving money away to a nonprofit organization or investing in like a mission and vision of the church. There's so many weird connotations with the church and money, which I totally understand because it's been abused over time. But when just looking at generosity as a whole, not even specific to the church, like when we give, it's a reminder to me that there's more to this life than just like what I can consume. You know what I mean? And it kind of points me to heaven. You know what I mean? It reminds me like, oh yeah, I'm not going to just splurge my entire life on what's in front of me here on earth, because I recognize I can give this away, because I know one day like none of this is going to matter. And it reminds me of heaven when I give that way. You know what I mean?
100%. And one of the things of truth, there's multiple tests of truth, but one of the tests is it experientially true. So meaning if I am to give my money away, do I experience this happiness? Do I experience something transcendent, this peace, this excitement? Because that would be counterintuitive to what we think. Well, what I would highly encourage, there's a book called The Paradox of Generosity. There's lots of TED Talks, and these are not God-based. These are not like, hey, let me start from the scriptures.
Yeah, it's just studying the psychology of it all.
Yeah, these are going, okay, here's people who made a choice to be extraordinarily generous, and the paradox is that they are more happy than they've ever been.
Yeah.
So this is like, just take take, some of the, stigmas and things off the table, if we just looked at that, then you put God with that, you mix God into that and Jesus and what he taught about money and everything, it begins to make more sense. Like, Jesus is really for us. He's not against us.
Yep.
And there's something not only beautiful to reward us here, there's something beautiful to reward us in eternity.
Yeah.
And Jesus promised that over and over.
Yeah. And I mean, money is just one example. I think
Yeah.
there's like doing good things oftentimes feels like an act of obedience,
Sure.
To Jesus, to God.
Yeah.
And it's like, I really don't want to do this in every fiber of my being, but I'm going to obey God in this way.
Mm-hmm.
And in the act of doing it, it points me to heaven. It reminds me of something bigger than myself because it's strictly out of that obedience that it does that.
Yeah. I mean, I had a conversation last week with an individual who went downtown. They're serving these teenagers that are homeless and have been kicked out of their house for a myriad of reasons. The predominant reason they were kicked out of their house is because of their sexual orientation. And so they're living on the streets. This person goes and decorates the basement they live in. They provide food. And when I talk to this person, I'm like, man, that's a big sacrifice. She's got kids and all this kind of stuff. And she said, Buck, I'm telling you, it's so rewarding. It's so life-giving. It's so like, its purpose, its meaning, its significance. I feel so alive. And again, there's reward in that, and there's reward in heaven for that.
Yeah. Man, that's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
That's really cool. You said something, a couple minutes ago about there not being sin in heaven. Mm-hmm. And I know that's kind of hard for us to understand sometimes as we try to wrap our mind around, one of the reasons that there is sin in this world is because God gives us free will. Mm-hmm. He is a loving God, therefore we have choice. We're not automatons. But in heaven, if there's no sin, how are we not automatons in heaven? Mm-hmm. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah. So the best I have on that right now, and maybe, again, 6 months or 5 years from now, I'm going to mature, God willing, and, go like, oh, here's a better answer. But the best I got right now is I'll make 3 comments. The first one is I think the confusion with rewards in heaven, which is, there's a lot of confusion, and it's fair. It's kind of like, the first question, skepticism of NDEs, fair. I think a lot of it is because we don't have context for a non-sinful world. We don't have context to go, hey, here's somebody's getting something I feel like I deserve and to be happy for them, like continually. We don't have context to buy, I don't have context to have all these delicious foods and say like stop and, a world absent of gluttony.
Yeah.
In heaven, there's going to be beautiful individuals, attractive individuals. Like we don't have context to go, well, I'm not going to lust. And then that's the beginning of this snowball effect. We don't have context for that. We don't have context for a world absent of selfishness.
Yep.
But if you could for a second, just again, use your imagination, it brings such clarity to the conversation about rewards. It brings such clarity to what heaven could be like as the scriptures paint them. But again, that's a world we've never experienced. We are so indulged in this world that is saturated with sin, and it's been that way for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, and we are immersed in it, and it's normalized. So when you talk about a world where, there's rewards and some get more than others, we begin to project what we know upon this world to come.
Right.
And that makes it extraordinarily difficult. There's a tension, and there should be a tension. I mean, that's a human thing. We're like, oh my gosh, like I can't imagine that world. Well, that's why it's called eternity. That's why Jesus said it's the world to come, and death is a doorway to that.
Yeah.
So I think when it comes to sin, I think that's an important point to think through. If you're listening and you feel tension, I think one of the reasons why you feel tension is because it's almost impossible to visualize a world without sin. So secondly, is there sin in heaven? I would answer the question as of today. I would say that yes, you have the capacity to sin in heaven. And I would also say that yes, you have free will in heaven. I think it makes you who you are. But I think there are 2 factors that say with the capacity to sin and with a free will in heaven, I think the reason why we don't leverage our free will to sin are 2 things. I think the first is the new covenant. So when Jesus came and established the new covenant, this is between God and all of mankind, and Jesus paid for our sin once and for all. And then I love what Jude says. I wrote down a couple scriptures that just talk about the implications of this new covenant. Jude, at the end of the letter of Jude, it says to him, and I love this, just, I'll try to read this slow just so we can absorb it. He says, to him who's able to keep you from stumbling and present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. To the only God, our Savior, be glory, majesty, power, and authority through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forever more. And this idea is like Jesus is who sustains us from sinning because of the new covenant. Mm-hmm. And a picture of this is that picture where he was talking to Peter in Luke. I wrote down Luke chapter 22, verse 32. He says, Peter, like Satan was trying to get you. Like you had the capacity to be taken out. But I stepped in for you, and I prayed for you that you may not fail. And so the picture we get in eternity is that Jesus is at the right hand of God. He is stepping in for us. He is renewing things. He is faithful to keep us from stumbling with our free will. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole lot more to say in terms of the new covenant, which is not the old covenant, which is the Old Testament between God and the nation of Israel, and the Messiah is the promised one. But since Jesus has shown up, this new covenant exists not only here to forgive us from our sin, but in heaven it prevents us from our sin. So that new covenant is continual, perpetual, eternal. And the second piece of that is the idea of the presence of who we're in. So, and this is a little bit more practical, but to think of if you have free will, and the first time you met me, now, and I'm not saying I'm impressive by any means, so please don't read that into what I'm about to say. But the first time you met me, I think, I don't know, you're 16, 15, whatever, mm-hmm. and you had all the capacity in the world to sin. You probably walked in that room, sinning before we met or something, mm-hmm. or whatever. But when you were in my presence, oftentimes they're like, oh my gosh, he's the pastor. Again, I'm not saying I'm anything special. I'm just saying I think this illustration makes sense. And you're like, oh my gosh, he's the pastor, and I got to watch what I say. And it's funny to see how people like, oh my gosh, they don't cuss around me. They say like, Jiminy Cricket, when they get upset. And I'm like, they watch everything they do because they're in my presence.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just a wee little man. I'm probably a larger wee little man, but that's all I am. I am so human. I am just like you, and you're just like me.
Yeah.
Now you stand in the presence of the Holy of Holies. You stand in the presence of the Almighty. You stand in the presence of the one that Moses got a glimpse of God and had to put a veil. He couldn't fully see God or he would die.
Yeah.
He had to put a veil because his holiness was so radiant. It was so powerful. And in heaven, it says that Jesus and God, they are with us. They're with us. So it's not absent of Jesus and God, like, hey, we're hanging out his holiness is radiant. His presence is radiant. Everywhere we go, we feel it. And that's what provides the perpetual happiness in the midst of getting rewards, good or bad. And that's what keeps us because we're in his presence. We're no longer like, hey, there's one day we will be with him. Mm-hmm. That's our reality today. Now we're with him. And in his presence, even though you have the capacity, you will not sin because you are in the presence of the Holy of Holies. And so I think we can kind of wrap our minds around that a little bit when you're in the presence of, somebody who's super religious, super spiritual. You're like, and you have an incredible amount of respect for.
Yeah.
Well, that's just a drop in the ocean of what it will be like to stand in the very presence of our Heavenly Father.
Yeah.
And in that moment, in those moments, in all of eternity, yes, we can choose to leverage our free will because it makes us who we are.
Yeah.
But his faithfulness steps in and prevents us from doing that.
Yeah.
In the new covenant, and the very presence of God keeps us from leveraging our freedom to choose to do the very thing of not trusting, not loving God. Yeah. And so I think that's a radical difference from earth and heaven. And that's why, we leverage our freedom here to do what we want to do. I think there we still have freedom, but we won't leverage it to sin.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've heard you tell stories of, golfing with people, mm-hmm. and you go golfing with them and they don't know you're a pastor. And then at some point, they're cussing and they're having a good time. And then at some point they, at some hole, you're like, well, what do you do for a living? And you're like, well, I'm a pastor. And then after that, the next holes, they're like, hey, I'm so sorry I said that back there. And they stop cussing. And it's like.
It's so, yeah. And it's such a buzzkill, and it's kind of, I try to, I've thought many times about lying. And so, sinning or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm a teacher.
Yeah.
And they're like, where do you teach? I teach at this place in Cedar Park. It's all kinds of people. It's great. It's great,
It's a counselor.
Yeah, counselor, things of that nature.
Anything but the P word.
Oh, yeah. It really is a buzzkill. And then you see people, this is not all the time, but it's funny, the way they talked about the cart girl, the way they talked about, their career, the way they talked about, either politics or people, the way they, just talked about everyday life. I mean, we can go 9 holes, 12 holes. I mean, they just let it it go. And all of a sudden when I said this, like, it's silence for the rest of the round.
Yeah.
And it's like, as much as I go, I'm like, hey, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. So
Yeah. I think another aspect, just as we ask these kind of difficult questions, like, is there sin in heaven? And what is, all of these things. One of the things that it's not an intellectual argument for God or for heaven or any of those things, but it's always given me a sense of confidence and comfort in my faith to go, if I could understand everything about God and what he has prepared for us, he would not be God then by definition. God, if he's infinite and I am finite, then there's no way I will ever be able to wrap my mind around him fully. And there's no way I'm going to ever have every single question I have fully answered. And I find hope in that because it reminds me of how big and grand and beautiful that he is. And so I think sometimes we want to have all these questions answered so we can put him in a box. And by definition, he'll never be put in the box. And we've just got to recognize that. And that kind of creates a sense of awe and worship when you begin to think about, God being like that. So
yeah, I agree.
So as we wrap up this series, one of the things that we've said throughout the entire thing is what you believe about eternity will determine how you live today. As we wrap up, I just want to say this last question for this series. What is your hope for people who have been engaging with this, who have been with us this entire time throughout this series?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask this. So, I thought about a couple things. And I think, I think I ended with it when I said, my greatest hope is that we all enter into, the life to come eternity, and we are welcomed home. Like, we are prepared, we are excited. We are hearing the words, well done, good and faithful servant. We are rewarded like no tomorrow. We have lived our life for something far beyond us. I think that's my greatest hope, that we're all welcomed home. And that's welcomed home because I didn't believe in Jesus. And because of the series, I really considered who Jesus was. I asked questions, and my curiosity led to a discovery that he is who he claimed to be, and I put my faith and confidence in him. There's such freedom in that. And so that would be my number one. I think the second thing I would really love is for people to experience peace in this world, and for people to realize that this world is not their home. And when you realize that this is not your home, we are simply ambassadors. Our home is the home to come. It gives explanation and context for so much of the suffering, hardships, difficulties, anxieties, stress that we feel. And knowing that there will be a day everything will be reconciled. There will be a day God will, work all things for the good. There will be a day we stand before our Heavenly Father, and he will give us all the context we need to have the aha moment to go, that's how they fit together. I could never see that in my finite ability. But now that I have time and I have eternity, I see the big picture, and you are fair, you are loving, you are a good Father. I think if we can live with that disposition as much as possible, it just allows us to sleep well at night. We can close our eyes and just relax. We can, just soak into our bed. We can face a lot of difficulty and hardship and be human, and at the same time find a peace that transcends, because we know God is working all the time, that God is present all the time when we understand and when we don't understand. And so there's an incredible peace that frees you from anxiety, frees you from stress, frees you from the, pursuits of this world. And then I think last of all is just, one of my greatest hopes is that you live with urgency. I cannot get away from the fact that when I read the scriptures, Jesus, in Matthew 28, it's emphatic. He says, go. And I said that very softly.
Yeah.
It would almost, he's yelling, go.
Yeah.
Go. And in Luke 16, he says, leverage your worldly wealth to gain friends. Leverage your resources, your time, your energy. The very thing we can do on this earth that we cannot do in eternity is share the gospel and inspire people to follow Jesus. What better way to live your life, your whole life, thinking about, the Schindler List moment? Okay, what can I do with this? He was, how many more Jews can I buy to save from the concentration camps? We have the opportunity to go, how many more people can we influence? How many more people can we share this incredible news that they can experience freedom from the shame of the past? They can be unshackled from the sins of the past. They can be forgiven. They can know their identity is secure in God, that they're a son or daughter of God, to know that their eternity is secure. It's the most incredible news, and it's a gift. It's the only world religion to where God gave it to you as a gift, and it's grace. And our only choice is just to go, I trust that. It's the most spectacular news. And to spend our lives with that kind of urgency, as Jesus did and the disciples did and these first century followers of Jesus did, it is, as we talked about earlier, There's reward in itself in generosity. There's reward in itself of doing good deeds. There's reward in itself of meeting the needs of people around you. But there's also eternal rewards. And if we can live more with that tension as a result of this series, I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Man, that's a great way to wrap things up. It's been an awesome series. I think many of us have been just grateful for the conversation and the growth coming from it. So thank you for, just walking our entire church through this. Really, really exciting. This week we're jumping into Easter.
Oh, yeah.
Easter's around the corner. Pretty big deal.
Every year it's about the same thing.
Every year it's about the same thing. And so I'm excited about that. If you haven't booked your seat yet, we're running low, but jump on Saturday services. Saturday services are still available. So reserve your seat at mpaustin.com/Easter, and we will see you guys Sunday, either live, online, or in person.
Awesome.
All
Thanks,
right.
Jeremy. Thank you guys for listening.